Hey y'all, we are back again with Poli-Side-Eye. This is my friend Jared, as you know, the political scientist. Is that right? I can call you that?
Yeah, I in training.
Okay, yeah, I think you're a scientist by now.
Almost.
How has your week been?
My week has been pretty good. I am working on a couple papers, so that are due both on May 31st.
Oh,
I'm
wow.
submitting to some journals, so I've been steadfast in trying to get those edits done and reading
Hey,
stuff.
you're going to be working while we're on vacation?
My goal is to have it done and submitted before then. It's my goal, which is why I've been working so hard the past couple of weeks or so. So
Oh, okay.
hopefully, but if that doesn't happen, I might have to slip away for a little bit to finish up some things. So I'm fingers crossed, hope to be done before then.
Oh, okay. Well, you can always bring a book to the club. We'll be sitting down.
Hey,
So,
listen. I've been in the club reading before, and you've
are
seen
you
it happen.
serious?
So I've been in the club reading stuff before. Not like physically a book, but I'll read, not like a physical book, but I've read stuff on like the book app and in the club.
With Kaya playing in the background.
Yeah, with Kaya playing in the background, busted wide open, this, that, and the other, and I'm sitting here reading about some Marxist theory. Yes, it's happened before, but I'm gonna try not to do that and not be that lame. So.
Oh, okay. Well, speaking of work, this episode will be focused on the labor force, 9 to 5s, and the unemployment situation right now because President Biden is like, you ninjas need to get off of this and get back to work now. I don't even know where to begin. This conversation was inspired by our last episode because I love that book title, like Work Doesn't Love You Back. What is it?
Work won't love you back.
Work won't love you back. I just love that quote. Can you give people like a little summary of that book?
Sure. So most of us, especially if you're a millennial, we're always hearing that you should find your passion, and if you find what you love or you're doing what you're loving, you'll never work a day in your life. And that whole kind of mythology of like careerism or working. So she tries to turn that myth in its head, and she tries to trace essentially when that became like this predominant view of working. So it's important to understand that for most of American history, it was nobody wanted to work. Like, in fact, it's important to know that America has been a site of class struggle throughout its history. And so for most of American history, people have been resigned to working because they have to provide for themselves. But generally speaking, no one loved their job. Like, it was something I had to do, and I clocked in, I clocked off, and I did what I did. But now it's turned into this: if you're not invested in your job, if you're not, checking emails on the weekends and doing everything and building your brand and this constant need to just be invested in your work, then somehow you're a slacker. So she tries to trace how that happened. Like, how did it become the case that people believe that being a workaholic was somehow a good trait? And what she argues is that there has been like a profound cultural shift, elite-driven cultural shift over the past essentially 40 or 50 years or so, to try to get people to buy into this notion that work isn't just something you have to do, but is a part of like yourself and something that you should be investing in yourself. This kind of idea of human capital, which I've talked about before. And what it really does is it puts all of the onus on, it's the kind of the responsibility self-help thing that we've always talked about. Like, if you're not working hard, if you're not investing in yourself, it's your fault. And so you can't blame anybody if you don't have a roof over your head or if you can't provide for yourself, because you should have just worked a little bit harder. And if you would have, woke up at 5 o'clock and grinded until midnight, you wouldn't be in this situation. So it's an ideology that people have come to view as kind of not everybody, but many people have come to view as this kind of common sense understanding of the way that the world should be ordered. Now, with the pandemic, and I said this shortly after everything shut down, that part of the reason that businesses and elites were so in a rush to reopen everything is because I think a lot of people were starting to peel back the onion a bit and say, wow, like, this shit is actually kind of fucked up. It's actually nice not to be working myself to the bone and like working myself into the ground. Like it's nice to actually be able to wake up without setting an alarm. It's actually nice to be able to do things I enjoy. Oh, like I could actually do most of the things that I do from the comfort of my own home. People are starting to get this idea that working yourself to death is not necessary. And that is a problem for the capitalist class, because for them, like they need people to believe this myth of like working hard because it pays off for them. Like
Right.
you're essentially cogs in their business of generating profit. And so by people understanding that they don't need to do that and that they could actually live a decent life without resorting to like this ridiculous amount of labor, that's presenting a very real problem for a lot of political elites. And so I think what we're seeing right now is this battle over the terms of this myth. And I'm hoping that we can continue to struggle against this narrative that people aren't working because they're lazy or because they just want to be, mooch off the government or whatever, which we know is all just essentially propaganda that the government just peddles to get people to get information behind this crazy ideology.
Oh my gosh. So you basically summed up this entire episode in 7 minutes, maybe less than that. Like there's so many ways I want to go right now. I was just thinking, shit, where can I go? So first of what you were talking about is the phrase where if you like doing something, you'll never work a day in your life, or sleep is for the weak. Do you think both of those phrases are propaganda?
Absolutely. It absolutely is.
Even for something that I love to do, like it's still me being exploited.
So let's take a step back. And so let's think about the idea of how do we even get to this idea of a 9-to-5 job? Because I think it's important to understand the history of this. So as I said earlier, America's history has long been marked as a class struggle. We won't learn this in school because that's just not what school is going to do. So if you're interested in this, feel free to ask. I can recommend some sources. But there's one really good book that I read maybe a couple of years ago that really is it's a really interesting book. Essentially, the thrust of the name of the book is called Inventing the People. And so what the author is trying to get at is, okay, so the American Revolution, what we forget about America is that America was supposed to be a bourgeois democracy. And the bourgeois part is very important because our founding fathers, who we just put on this pedestal, their idea of America wasn't one where anybody, regardless of their background or all of these things, everyone would be able to work together and just be this harmonious. No, like their idea was, we want this land for ourselves being rich white men, and we want to be able to essentially create all of this wealth for ourselves, like and hoard and accumulate all of this land and property and all of these things. For them, they had a very clear idea of who was going to do that. Now, what they soon learned was that, oh shit, like we can't really get all of this shit if we just do by our own means. So we have to figure out a way to like get people to buy into our idea of what we view America to be. And so they're like, well, how do you get people to buy into this idea that I should just be working for rich white men? Well, we have to create like this myth of like a nation, like we're all in this together. So there's this whole idea of nationhood. And that's why patriotism and all of these things are so powerful, because it creates this myth that we're kind of all in this together. Mm-hmm. But after the Civil War, which, yes, it was a fight over slavery, but part of the reason that slavery was so integral in this battle between the North and the South is because the North, although we tend to think of the North being against slavery because the myth is that, oh, the North is so great, they cared about Black people and wanted to
free them. They're the good guys.
Right. No, they just wanted Black bodies, Black people, because they didn't even really view them as people. They just wanted Black folks to be able to labor for them to help build their wealth in what was becoming an industrial North. But Black people knew it was up. They were like, we don't want to like just work and make profit. Like, what's in it for us? Just give us some land, 40 acres in the mule, give us some land. Let us do our own thing. Like, we don't want to be out here. Like the idea of working for somebody and just using your labor for somebody else it was nonsensical to them. And so, of course, Black people, as they often were, knew it was up before everybody else did. And so part of the reason that Reconstruction failed is because the state did not protect Black people's demands of just being able to live on their own and not be forced into this wage labor. So it's also important to realize that a wage labor system was often referred to as slavery post-Civil War. People who were in these wage positions referred to it as slavery. Like working at it, selling your labor was viewed as tantamount to slavery, not chattel slavery, but it was still viewed as slavery. People were still talking about working for other people in these terms of like, no, we don't want to deal with this. And so there was a lot of class struggle between labor and capital, pretty much from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And what ends up happening is that after World War I and II, there ended up being this kind of truce, if you want to call it that, between labor and capital. Or if for people who are not familiar with the term capital, I'll say labor and business. Business was like, you know what, we'll accept some of the terms. We'll give you benefits and a decent wage, and we'll give you what needs to happen so you can live a good life and all of this. Of course, there were a lot of caveats.
What I really hate is a job being connected to healthcare. In order for you to get healthcare, you gotta have a job in order to get good healthcare at least.
Yeah, so there's a historical precedent for this, which is what I was just about to say. So part of what the benefits were when this was all happening, there was rationing going on. So not only could people be limited as to what they could actually consume, but there was also wage freezes. So part of the way that labor bargained for more rights for workers was through benefits. So healthcare and access to cheap home loans and things like that. Of course, there is a huge caveat being that many Black people were not able to take part in all of this. So it's important to keep that in mind. But I do think understanding the overarching struggle of labor over America's history is important to understand how the notion of a 9-to-5 came into being. So let's fast forward a little bit to the late 60s, early 70s. What you end up after the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement, the left movement, and all of this new cohort of individuals was kind of like, we don't want this whole ridiculous system that America has set up where you just go to some factory and just work and then come home. And then it's so mundane. Like, no, we want real rights. We want a real democracy where we have a say in our own livelihoods and so on. And the business class was like, yeah, fuck that. That's not going to happen. What ends up happening is that there is an aggressive movement to suppress any type of labor uprisings in the late 60s, early 70s. But we end up with a situation where essentially labor has become so weakened that they don't really have a say in the conversation anymore. So businesses then dictate the terms of what work is going to look like. So of course, they're going to dictate this in terms that are favorable to them. So the way they do this is by trying to paint work not as some like exploitative endeavor, but rather, no, you should find joy in the things that you want to do. And it's not a job, it's a career. Like, in just reframing it as all of these other terms to just essentially cover over the fact that it really is what it is, exploitive wage labor. Of course, none of this was taught to us in schools because schools are essentially propaganda. I mean, let's just be real about it. And so we grow up thinking that, well, I go to school so I can get a good job that I hopefully will love, and I'll invest myself into this job, and I'll work hard and be career driven and all of these things. And so I think it's important to understand that history, because it hasn't always been that way. It hasn't always been understood that you should be investing yourself into your job. Does that mean you can't enjoy doing things that you do or enjoy work that you have? Absolutely not. Like, who am I to say that you can't enjoy doing something? But I do think it's important to understand that there is a historical precedent behind this narrative that if you aren't invested in your job, you aren't rising and grinding, that you're somehow less than. Like, that was an ideology that was created and pushed by the business class at a very specific juncture in American history.
So a segue I want to get to is just speaking of us growing up and millennials, do you think we got the short end of the stick? Because I just feel these days, like millennials, when we turned 30, it was like, I'm not exactly where I thought I would be. Or like when I graduated college, there weren't that many jobs. Like, this was 2008. I had my business administration degree, marketing, all that type of background. I get into the field, I'm like, Sales jobs, $12 an hour, commission. I'm gonna go back to serving. So yeah, because I just feel like it was just like a difference. Who was before us, Generation X? I feel like
The baby
they had
boomers.
jobs.
Yeah. The baby boomers, which would be our parents' generation, is probably the last generation that got the good side of capitalism. I'm putting that in air quotes because I don't think there is such a thing, but the better deal out of capitalism. Because after the war, the Second World War, so I would say from about the early 1940s through the mid 1960s, there was this period of just profound economic expansion that really came to, I won't say to a halt, but slowed dramatically in the late 60s, early 70s. But even then, there was still a lot of expansion going on and people were being incorporated. And you could still get a pretty good job, even if you didn't have, we hadn't developed an economy around requiring a college degree for good employment, i.e. employment that pays people a livable wage that they could actually live off of and provide for themselves and their family if they have one. But that's not the case anymore. And so how do you get people to buy into a system that if you just have two eyes and can look around you, you can see that the types of jobs that are available are not the types of jobs that you can actually live and sustain yourself off of. So the other day I was looking at the Department of Labor posts every year, the fastest growing jobs, and they do a projection to kind of indicate how industries are changing and where jobs are being created. Do you know by far the industry that's producing the most jobs? Home health aides and aides in nursing homes. The median salary for those positions, not the average, the median, which is a much more indicative figure, is $25,000. $25,000 for those
And
jobs.
this is why the OnlyFans market is booming, because people rather bust it wide open than making $25,000 a year.
Yes. And of course, it's not lost on me, although it's not discussed enough, in my opinion, that job, 70% of those jobs are performed by women. Of that, 40% of those women are Black women, and another like 20% of them are Latino women. So most of the people who are going to end up in these low-paying jobs, just being exploited beyond compare, are Black and brown women. So I just think that that's something we need to talk about more. And the reason that I get so annoyed by this, work, if you're not working hard, and these jobs, you are working hard, like the hours are relentless and you're getting paid pennies on the dollar. And so it frustrates me when the narrative around like unemployment is that people who are escaping the labor market because there is a generous, I'm putting air quotes because I don't think it's that generous, but a generous, as some people would say, injection of federal dollars into the social system. It makes sense. Like, why would you not take this money if it's here versus going and work in these crazy conditions where you're getting paid pennies on the dollar? And then some will say, well, go get an education. Well, as we've already talked about, that obviously isn't a guarantee. So ultimately, the conditions are such that the likelihood is greater that you will end up in a job that is not going to pay you well, or at least not pay you enough to live a comfortable life. And so the opportunity presents itself where the government has actually invested somewhat. I still don't think it's generous enough, but has invested somewhat in securing a decent living conditions for some people. So why wouldn't they jump on that? But of course, the business class is going to turn this into lazy people and moochers, and they just want a government handout and all those other things. And so we need to be talking about these statistics to let people know that no, like people are doing this because the conditions under which they were working were so exploitative, were so bad that of course they wouldn't want to go back and work in some ridiculous labor market making $12 an hour. Who would?
Right. And of course, we have a pandemic to thank for that, I guess,
Exactly.
for showing us that.
Yes. I saw the other day that Biden made this proclamation that he was going to start enforcing the terms of these unemployment benefits. And if people aren't working, if they're able to work, then he's going to, essentially lay down the hammer. So he's peddling this narrative too. And that's why I get frustrated with Democrats, because we already get enough of that on the right. We don't need Democrats essentially subscribing to the same ridiculous propaganda that the right is already peddling, but they're going to do it anyway, because after decades and decades of propaganda, it's become common sense. So if the common sense idea is that you should be working, it's a good thing. The corollary of that is that good people work and bad people don't work. So we need to disrupt that, because that is really at the center of what's going on. And my fear is that the longer this goes on, the longer that narrative and that propaganda just festers and just circulates around our public discourse. I don't want to put it out into the universe, but it lends itself to the types of reactionary, backward politics that we end up getting, and why the right ends up being so successful, because they tap into this resentment that people have. And so I could easily see how someone could turn that into support for some crazy right-wing person.
I was just about to bring that up. Like, what about the people saying like, oh, well, I'm going to work. How's it fair this person gets to stay home and enjoy himself, you know?
I was reading an article, or it was actually a speech. There was an economist who was very integral in helping America to essentially weather the storm after the Great Depression. His name was John Maynard Keynes. And in the 1930s, he gave this speech, which was eventually turned into a paper, saying essentially that at some point, people are not going to need to work. Like, if they will work, they will only be working maybe 8 hours a week, 10 hours a week. And his rationale was that because of technological advancement, it would essentially reduce the need for people to actually labor. The idea around technology around that time was that with technological advancements, it would reduce the need for people to be out laboring. Because why would you need it? We would have robots, we'd have all of these new apparatuses. Apparata? What's the plural of apparatus? Apparatuses, I guess. I don't know.
Apparata?
Apparata, yeah, whatever the plural of apparatus is, we would have that. And so we wouldn't need people to be out here, toiling and so forth. In fact, this was an idea that was prominent as late as the 1960s. Even Martin Luther King in Where Do We Go From Here, a book which I've talked about before, he has this whole section in the book where he talks about very soon, one of our major social questions is going to be, what are people going to do with all this free time? Because we're going to have all of these social transformations and people won't be worried about labor anymore. It's not going to even be an important political question because people won't need to work. Or if they are working, you're going to only be working for, a few hours a week. And so it's not even going to be a question of like, how are people going to get good jobs? Because not only would we have these technological advancements, but the technological advancements would be able to help us generate so much new wealth that we could then distribute and share among ourselves, and everyone would be free to frolic and see the world and do whatever they wanted to do. Obviously that didn't pan out. My point is, we don't have to work. We create work because work in a lot of ways is a way that we can force compliance. And so again, we saw what happened during the first few weeks of the pandemic when a lot of people weren't working or when they were working from home. People started thinking, they started saying, oh, this shit is kind of fucked up. Maybe we should maybe start thinking about a different system. So work is a way that you can force compliance. It is a way of, I don't want to say social control, but in a lot of ways it is social control, because if you're working 40 hours a week, telling everybody to rise and grind, and you're up at 7 a.m, working until 6. If you have kids, you got to help them with their homework, and then you just wash, rinse, and repeat and do it every day. You don't have time to stop and think about radical politics or organizing or maybe thinking about or envisioning a different world. Like, you got to work. And then next thing you know, you're 60 and then your whole life has passed you by. And then it's like, well, I'm old now, so what the fuck? Like, I don't give a shit anymore. So and I'm not even being radical. There's actually a book called Bullshit Jobs. That's the book I'm going to recommend this week. It's called Bullshit Jobs. So that book is all about why is it that we are still working when everybody 80 years ago had predicted, and not just like radical people, like even the most centrist economists had predicted that at some point we weren't going to need all of these people in our economy to work. And he comes up with this thesis essentially saying that the reason we still have all of these bullshit. I mean, a lot of us have worked these bullshit jobs before where we probably could do all of our work in like 2 hours, but we got to spread it out and make it look like we're doing something. It's because, again, like, it is a means of social control. And when you have a society that is as unequal as ours is, the more that people start to understand that the system is not set up in a way for them, or I should say the system is set up for certain people and not for everyone, the more the opportunities for the types of demonstrations that could potentially disrupt the existing order, the more those opportunities present themselves. So elites have to come up with ways to get people to comply with the order, even if they don't think it's fair.
I feel like I'm in the Matrix or something.
You say that like all the time.
Work is a means of social control.
It is. I mean,
I feel like Oprah right now. Work is a means of social control. Right.
Got to do the hand gesture.
Are you working or being worked?
Right.
Are you in labor or are you laboring?
Exactly. Right.
It seems like you have a lot of socialist ideals. So I'm thinking like, okay, so if we don't need work, do you think that Americans should all have like a salary provided to them by the government? Kind of like what we're on now, like every American gets this amount of money a week.
Yeah, so that's an idea that's been thrown around for generations, this idea of essentially a universal basic income. So I don't know if I have a strong normative argument for or against it. I've thought about it, but I don't know if I've thought about it enough to present a very well articulated stance one way or the other. My immediate reaction is to say yes. I have heard some scholars who argue that, a universal basic income should only be implemented if it's not going to be means tested. So by what that means is that everybody would have to get it, irrespective of their stance in society. So everybody from Jeff Bezos to the poorest of persons would have to get this universal basic income. The idea being that the moment you start means testing, or what means testing means is that you have to determine eligibility based on need. So usually with different social programs, the state or the federal government or whatever agency is giving out the money comes up with some type of calculation to then determine like, okay, you don't need this based on your income and your social position and these things. But the argument against that is that we know that people start thinking about the world, our society, in terms of us versus them. So, oh, wait, why they got that money? Why I didn't get it? And so that type of behavior breeds resentment. So it turns into this bickering over deservingness. And so we also know that the questions of deservingness invariably take on a racist, sexist, anti-immigrant flair. And so I think one way around that might be to just give everybody, irrespective of their social class position, the money.
I feel like something that would help is a great minimum wage, at least, and then making education and healthcare free. That would help a lot of people. And everyone should have a home.
Yes, no, I totally agree with that. I think that would take drastic transformations to our political order, because, not to say it can't happen, but partially because the way that we interpret these things, because we've talked about this before, we interpret education as an investment. We interpret homes as an investment. We interpret all of these things as investments. And when we do that, it alters the way that we even understand what those services should be doing. And so I agree with you. I am a huge advocate of free education, but that needs to be coupled with an understanding that a good education does not necessarily mean getting a good job. And so I think, again, that goes back to the ideology I was saying before. Like, part of what we have to contend with is the common sense ideologies that undergird the way that people understand these systems.
I feel like we're going to need AOC in office or something. For something like that to happen.
Many AOCs, it can't just be one person. Clone her and send hundreds of her. That's what does.
Do you think this current administration has any capability to make positive change towards the labor force?
Positive change in what? In the way that people think about the labor force, or?
A higher minimum wage. Do you think he can do it in his 4 years? Would it change anything? Like, if you brought up the $15 an hour, I don't think it would, but.
In poverty, or
would it get people off of unemployment and going back to work?
So that's tricky. And so I think part of this is also understanding the way that welfare works in America. And so your favorite president, Bill Clinton, can't be left out of this conversation because This is why I drag Democrats too, because they've been very much integral in this project. But Clinton was the one who ended welfare as we know it, as he famously said himself, by passing the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act in 1996, I believe it was. And what it did was it tied unemployment benefits to work, but you have to work a certain number of hours to actually qualify for the unemployment benefits. And so that changes the dynamics, also gives a lot of flexibility to states to dictate the poverty threshold, to dictate the terms of what qualifies as good work and all of these other things. And so I would say that it would make a difference. And I'm absolutely in support of raising the minimum wage, but I also think it's important to understand how raising the minimum wage in and of itself is not enough. We also have to change the terms of the welfare state in a way that isn't punitive. And again, we know how this turns out. And that's why I get so frustrated with Biden and with the Democrats, because when you start peddling these narratives about people not working because they're lazy, it invariably descends into the welfare mothers and the welfare queens and all that stuff, because that's the type of environment that we've been enmeshed in American society. So yes, I do think it would help a lot of people, but who it would help is going to be limited because of this legislation and other pieces of legislation that have been passed over the past 30 or 40 years.
Well, I think we've brought home the point that work is a scam. And what I've taken away from this is there's been many propaganda that has been placed on us. I mean, even before I was born. And I'm pretty sure it's going to continue.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there a happy ending? Is there a silver lining? This is so depressing.
The silver lining is understanding that there is so much material out here that they've given the game away. It's not like any of this is a secret. There's a book called Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. He literally goes through step by step and explains why propaganda is used to control and to essentially force compliance with elite ideologies. So I think the way to change these things is to understand that this has all been going on and it's been very adamant. And so I would tell people, we don't have to be confused about what's going on. There's tons of material out here that they're telling us what they're doing.
Right.
Got to find it.
And also my message is to people, whoever is watching, if you're still in unemployment, do not feel bad about it. They will have to kick me off. They'll have to drag me.
Yes,
so,
kicking and screaming.
What is your actual book that you want to recommend?
So I will go ahead and recommend the book Bullshit Jobs, because I think it talks about a lot of the things that we talked about. And in particular, why are so many people being forced to work to the bones when we have enough resources in this country, the wealthiest country, to provide for everyone, but yet there are so many people who live without. And so I think that book offers a good background about how we got here.
And as always, where can they find you to,
heckle me?
Heckle you.
Nobody's actually heckled me though. So.
That's good. I mean, I feel like we have a lot of positive feedback under the videos. I think people appreciate this conversation. I definitely learn something every episode, as y'all can tell. But yeah, y'all can follow him on JC Tiger Fan, JayCtigerFan. I did it for you this time.
Thank you.
Always, you can follow me, CDIGGI1, on all platforms. Make sure y'all like, comment, and subscribe, and most importantly, share, please. So yeah, with that, we will see y'all for the next episode. Bye.